Hi, Emma. Thank you for joining us today. It's an absolute pleasure to have you on the podcast. Can you start by just telling our listeners a little bit about who you are and what it is that you do?
Yeah, certainly. Well, thank you so much for having me. My name's Emma, and I'm a paediatric dietitian and feeding therapist. And I specialise in helping parents with fussy eating, food allergies, and anything to do with children's nutrition.
Lovely. Okay, so let's dive straight into the good questions. What do you class as fussy eating?
So I would classify your typical kind of fussy eating that most children go through, that kind of toddler fussy eating where they're going through that typical kind of neophobic stage, which is that fear of new foods. Goes back to thousands of years ago when children could be slightly more mobile, so they then started to pick up poisonous foods. So it's this like inbuilt thing to protect children from, picking up basically anything poisonous. So basically what happens with fussy eating, it can last, and it tends to happen around sort of anything from 14 months to it can last as long as 4 years old, but often normally most toddlers sort of start to grow out of it. It drives parents absolutely mad because they've had a child who has weaned beautifully, eaten all the foods, and suddenly they hit about that age and they're suddenly like, but they're not eating the broccoli anymore, or they're not eating this anymore, and they used to. And why is that? And that's what I'd classify as your typical kind of fussy eating sort of stage that most children go through.
Okay. So when do we expect that they'll grow out of that?
So again, it should be, it varies massively depending on the child. So I would say it should last at least a few months, but it could be longer, and it can sometimes last sort of to 3 to 4 year olds. But most children should grow out of that kind of typical neophobic stage within a few months as well.
Okay, so it's a normal developmental stage that they're going to go through some fussy eating from about 18 months on.
Yeah, most children do. Not every child, but most children will go through that kind of stage.
Are there any red flags that we need to be looking out for as to that a child might not grow out of the fussy eating?
Yes, so red flags for me, I tend to call them more like problem eaters. So it tends to be when a child only eats sort of, it's not an exact number, but sort of less than 20 foods.
Right.
And I don't mean like 20 different types of cereal. I mean like 20 different kinds of different types of food. They might have issues with textures. So they may be that they don't like anything like pureed, or they don't like anything with lumps in it. And again, things like that are a bit of a sign that they're struggling. Another thing to look out for as well is food groups. So we tend to have your main food groups, so like your carbohydrates, your proteins, your dairy alternatives, and then your fruit and veg. So if you've got a whole one of those groups that they aren't having anything in, that for me is a bit of a concern that they're struggling somehow as well.
Okay, and what would you do about that if you felt that your child was reduced down to 20 foods and you felt like they were struggling?
I would definitely seek some help as well, because I think the sooner you get help, often the better. The longer it can go on, sometimes the worse it gets as well. So I definitely seek help. Speak to your health professionals. You can ask to be referred to a dietitian as well. If you're worried, particularly if you're worried about your child's nutrient intake as well. One thing we see a lot of is low iron intake, especially in children that are really quite restrictive eaters as well. And that can really affect appetite as well.
Okay,
so watching out for those kind of symptoms. But I would say get help, because the longer it goes on, sometimes the worse it can get as well.
Okay. And why are some children a lot more fussy or picky than others? Because sometimes we get these children that literally will just eat everything, go straight out of that phase, and it never seems to be a problem. What's the difference? Why is that?
I think it depends. So it depends on the child. Obviously, everyone's different in terms of their appetite, and all of those sort of things as well. It could be that there's sensory issues going on as well around food. It could be that they're struggling. There could be some kind of medical condition as well, that's something going on. It could be something to do with oral motor skills as well. So what I always say to parents is a lot of parents will come to me and say, it's just behavioural. My child's just being difficult around food. But they're normally not being difficult around food. Normally there's something that they need help and support with. And there's something going on, and it could be the textures. It could be, like I said, it could be anything to do with oral motor skills. It could be, that they're just struggling as well. And again, I always say this to parents as well, that something that I'm really dyslexic, and like you expect to help a child to read and write. But we don't always expect a child to, we expect a child to just be able to eat. We expect them to pick up the food, put it in their mouth and just eat straight away. But actually eating is one of the most complex things that we do as humans. So some children just need extra help with eating. It's the same way, you know.
In what way? Expand on that more.
In terms of eating, so if they're struggling, for example, with like, say, sensory issues around food, it may be that we need to help them on the sensory side. So one strategy that I use a lot with parents is something called the 32 steps to eating. So that might involve basically, so we think of food as we just pick it up and we put it straight in our mouth. But actually there's a whole 32 steps that involve all our different senses. And basically it could be that some children I'll see who are really struggling, maybe they can't even tolerate a food. They can't even look at the food without making them gag or vomit, and they're at that stage. So they're right at the bottom of the steps. So again, we'd work on strategies to help them be able to tolerate the food or be in the room with the food. And then we work up to the next step, which is more about interaction. So can we get them to help them just touch the food with maybe a spoon or with a toy or something like that? So again, we're working very, very slowly, completely away from meal times. And then we might then go to the next step where they might be able to touch the food. And maybe they can put it on, you know, their hands for like 2 seconds. And then we look at working up, you know, bit by bit to get closer to their face and mouth and everything else. And then we could smell the food. And then eventually we might get to the point where they can actually, you know, put the food in the mouth and they maybe can make a tooth mark on the food. And then there's another sort of 18 steps from licking a food to actually swallowing a food as well.
Wow.
So there's loads and loads of steps to eating. It involves all our senses to eat. So it is a really complex process. And I think as parents, sometimes we just assume that children are just going to be able to eat. But actually, some children just need help.
Absolutely. Well, it can sometimes be quite a bit of emotion attached to food, can't it? So as a parent, when the child rejects the food, it can almost sometimes feel a bit of a rejection of your love and your effort of what you've put into making this meal for them. So there's definitely a lot going on around food.
Yeah, definitely. And emotions are high as well. You have to feed your child like, you know, 6 times a day. You can't go on holiday and go, well, we won't bother this week. We'll have a week off from feeding. You've got to do it all the time. And it is stressful. And it is hard work. And if your child is restrictive and eating less and less foods, it's worrying for you as a parent because you want them to feed, you know, you want them to eat well, you want them to grow as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, you want to get that nutrition into them. So when you feel that they're restricting from something, my son, for example, he will not eat fruit, will not touch fruit. So you worry because what else can I get into him nutrition-wise that's going to make up for the fact that he's not got any of that in his diet? So absolutely. Are there any common mistakes then that as parents we make fussy eating worse?
I would say one of the biggest mistakes that I see is pressure. So applying pressure for a child to eat that food.
Right.
Especially, I would say, at meal times. And I would probably say especially at dinner time, because I think that's often the hardest meal for a child because they're tired, they're overwhelmed, they're not very well regulated. So they're already not in a great place and they often just want to eat something easy, you know, that doesn't take any skill and doesn't take any real effort as well. But parents are there. That's when maybe you've spent ages preparing a meal, especially in the evening, you know, and you want to sit down, you want to have a nice meal.
Yep, that whole family unit
family
meal.
Time, And that's when then you're sitting there and you then get annoyed because you're like, well, why are you not eating any of this food that I've given you? And you're not thinking about, well, what else have they eaten through the day? Maybe they front-loaded. So a lot of children will front-load and eat a lot of breakfast and then eat gradually less through the day as well. And we might not have seen that. So we might not have seen what they've eaten through the day. They might not be feeling particularly well as well. So again, that could be an influence as well. But then we start applying pressure that you must eat this or just have one more bite or just try a bit of this. I know you'll like it. And all that does is put pressure on the child, which then raises their cortisol levels, makes them feel more stressed and anxious. When you feel stressed and anxious, you don't eat because in terms, again, of our evolution, if we're in danger, we need to get away from that danger. And if you think about, in terms of our body, nothing's really changed in thousands of years in terms of how our body reacts. So if we start to feel really anxious or we start to feel really worried about something, eating is not a priority. We're not going to eat. We're not going to be in the best state to eat. So we need to be relaxed to eat and digest
parents
food.
are making the problem worse by putting pressure, causing the child's cortisone levels to raise, and therefore they're less likely to eat when we're actually trying to get them to eat. Right.
And I think the one more bite thing is a classic example. Like, just have one more bite or just eat that one carrot.
Yeah.
But then when you think about it, that, for example, say that carrot, how many extra calories and nutrients is that one more bite giving that child? Probably, 10, 15 calories? You're not really achieving anything, but you've suddenly made mealtime stressful, and you've probably put the things that child is not going to want to eat carrot now because of the pressure and the association with that food.
So say you've served dinner and you've served some peas and carrots and the child refuses to eat any peas or carrots. How do you get them to at least try something so that they've entertained the idea of having some nutrition in their meal as well?
So I would say it's fine to expose them. And what I would do is do a mealtime routine where you have the food in the middle of the table and the child can help themselves to the food. We don't serve up all the food on the plate to start with because that can be quite overwhelming for a child as well. If it's a new food that your child has never eaten, so say your child's never eaten peas before, it's not a safe, preferred food, trying to get them to eat it at dinner is not the time to do it. Right. So what I would do, and what I did a lot with my little girl, was we did these like Strictly Come Dancing food challenges where we would take a food, like we did things like kiwi, we did pomegranate, we did lots of different things, and we made it into, let's find a fun recipe that goes with this food. Right. Let's make something in the day, just for fun, no pressure that you're going to have to eat it. She could help me cut it up. She could help, stir it in, whatever we were making. And all of that is the 32 steps. So therefore, by my little girl, like cutting up the kiwi, she hated kiwi, cutting it up, putting it in like a yogurt thing, playing with it, putting it in little containers, all of that was the steps to eating. That was all exposure to the food. If I'd done the same thing at the end of the day, at dinner time, we would have had a full-on, I'm not eating this is disgusting, this is yuck, I hate it. Right. We're not achieving anything by doing it then. But if we do it and expose a child to a food away from a mealtime in a kind of more relaxed setting, we've got much more chance of them interacting with the food and then hopefully eventually accepting that food into their into their diet.
And might you have to go through that process several times before they'd be prepared to try it?
And again, there are some studies, and it depends on the child. Sort of, they can go from anything from 10 exposure to some children. There are some children like with autism, and there are some studies around that they need like 60 exposures to a food. Most parents give up about the second or third exposure and go, well, my child doesn't like this, I'm never making this again. That's the end of it. But actually, you have to keep going through that exposure because maybe your child's really struggling with that particular food, so they need to see it over and over and over again before they're okay.
Before they'd be willing to give it a go.
Yeah.
Wow, okay, that's really interesting to know because you're right. I probably would have given up after the second or third attempt.
But you do because you don't want to keep cooking something or making something thinking your child's not going to eat it. Yeah. But if you take it away from mealtimes, it takes that pressure. And I'm not saying you can't serve that food and you wouldn't serve those peas and the carrots sort of in the middle of a table. That's absolutely fine. But just don't apply the pressure that they have to eat them.
Okay. So what are some simple things then parents can try at home to make mealtimes less stressful?
So one thing I would do is, first of all, try and get your child regulated. So first of all, this might sound counterintuitive, get them running, jumping, moving around before a meal. This can help them regulate them before they're coming to sit down for the meal.
Right.
I would also do some kind of transition activity to bring them to the meal because if you're the parent cooking and you're in that kitchen, you're getting all the sights of the food, you're getting the smells, you're getting everything about eating and it's sending those messages to your brain to go, right, well, we're going to eat food. Your child's in the other room or somewhere else playing, they're not getting any of those messages to tell their body that it's time to eat. So if you can bring them into the kitchen, even if it's just something as simple as stirring the food or putting, their knives and forks on the table or putting a cup on the table, something really, really simple, depending on, obviously, the age of your child. Obviously, if they're older, they can probably do more. But, if you've got a really little one, just something really, really simple. Then something like washing the hands. So again, sending the message to the brain that we are going to eat in a bit. And then bringing everyone sort of to the table. Obviously, it completely depends on the child. Some children I work with couldn't even be in a kitchen and, they have to eat in the living room. And that's where they are at the moment.
Okay.
But say your child is able to come to the table and you do normally eat at a meal. I would then have all the food in the middle and have an empty plate with an empty placemat as well. So again, food can be put onto that placemat if they don't want it. And then everyone serves themselves as well. And they can help serve you your food as well. Because again, That's exposure to other
Okay.
food.
Yeah.
And then what I'd also do as well is make sure they are sitting correctly, because I see this a lot. So a lot of parents will put a child where they get out of a high chair and then they go into like an adult chair.
Mm-hmm.
And your child's there wriggling, they're sitting on their knees, they're moving around. And one thing that's really, really important, the body, basically the most important thing for the body is breathing.
Yeah.
Second most important thing is postural stability. Our brain likes to be quite stable. Right. So, for example, if you go to a bar and you know you're those bar stools where you don't put your feet down and your back's not supported and you're really uncomfortable, how long are you going to sit and eat food for? Probably not very long, and that's probably the whole intention, is they want you out of that, quickly.
Yeah.
So if your child's not sitting properly and they're not properly supported with their feet, firmly on the floor or some kind of stool or something to keep them, and their knees aren't at a 90 angle and their hips aren't at a 90 angle, that can really affect eating.
Gosh, okay. That's really good to know.
And I know for my little girl, I ended up buying like a cheap version of a Trick Track type chair, one of those ones that's got all the support and you can adjust and everything else. And that made a big difference to her eating, because she was up, down, on her knees, moving, really uncomfortable.
Yeah, it's hard to keep children still at the dinner table.
And again, they might get up and get down. So again, you don't expect them to sit for a long time. 5-10 minutes is probably about as much as you're going to get.
Yeah.
But if you at least know that they're stable and they're in a good position, that can sometimes make a big difference as well.
Amazing. Okay, so posture and serve the food in the middle and then let them help themselves so that they're getting that exposure and they're choosing what they want for themselves.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. Is it okay to offer alternatives if they won't eat what you've served?
So personally, I wouldn't offer an alternative, because sometimes what happens is then that creates that whole thing that, mum or dad are just going to make me something different if I don't have this food. What instead I would do is make sure there's something on that plate that is a preferred option or a food that you know that they can eat.
Right.
So say, for example, they can eat pasta or they can eat rice. Don't serve up something like, say, for example, like lasagna that they've never eaten before. They don't like any of the sauce. They don't eat any of the meat. You can't expect them to eat that because they've never eaten it before and they're not going to suddenly just eat it at dinner time. So you want to make sure there's something on that plate that they are able and they have the skill level to eat. So that's how I would
What if
manage
they
it.
then just only eat that?
That's okay.
Yeah.
As a parent, there's something called division of responsibility. And basically, we are responsible for providing the food and the child is responsible for what and how much of that food that they eat. Okay. It's not our responsibility to make a child eat a certain amount of food. What we can do is we serve the food, we do a clear-up routine, get rid of the food at the end. Sometimes children will eat extra when you're doing that clear-up routine and you're getting things in a, bin or a thing, because there's no pressure to eat it at the table. And then what you can do is a bedtime snack. So if that's like an hour and a half, 2 hours later, you've got another eating opportunity, as I like to call them, that they can then eat potentially something, like a bowl of cereal or yogurt and fruit, whatever it is, you can do something then. So what I like to think of is there's almost like 6 eating opportunities through the day that you've got when your child can eat, but it's not our responsibility to make them eat every single meal. That is down
So you'd
to
be
them.
offering, 3 meals and 3 snacks in a day?
Yeah, you wouldn't necessarily need the bedtime snack, but I would say if they hadn't eaten anything at dinner and they seem, then a bedtime snack could be an option. But no, normally, typically it's 3 meals and 2 snacks. But again, depends on the child. Yeah. And we particularly if they're low weight or things are going on.
So is it ever okay to say to them at dinner, just have a mouthful of peas?
I wouldn't, because again, you're applying pressure and you're sort of saying, like this, you should eat this and that sort of thing. It's kind of down to them. Some parents will, and it all depends on the child as well, because again, some children aren't really restrictive. It all depends on. So a lot of the children I work with, some of them are really, really restrictive eaters. So if you started saying you have to eat this or a mouthful of that, that would really stress them out and send them, be far too much for them as well. So I would say try not to. What I would do instead in that situation is I would eat them yourselves, but ask your child to talk about the sensory properties of them. Like, could they squeeze them? Could they get their fingers and just push them? Could they count how many there are on the plate? So focus more on the sensory side of the food, making it fun rather than being, can you eat
Too much
mouthfuls?
pressure.
Yeah.
So how can we go about encouraging them to try new things?
So this is where I do them away from the meal times.
Right.
And this is where I would do sort of the cooking, the baking, getting them interacting, even simple things like just having like children's knives and just getting them to cut the vegetables for you.
Involving them in that mealtime prep.
Yeah, cutting the fruit for mummy. So you're making mummy a fruit salad today. Let's just cut up a load of fruit and let's put some sticks in. You know, with kiwi and stuff, my little girl loved them cut up into tiny, tiny little squares because she didn't like touching them. And she liked using a little, one of those little like picker thing, you know, those little like to like touch, so you didn't have to touch it, but it was in there. And then it was in a cupcake little thing. So it was all really fun. Loads of exposure to kiwi. We've exposed kiwi for a long, long time. And eventually she loves kiwi now. But kiwi has to be presented in a little cupcake thing with a little like toothpick. Yeah. So that basically that's how so sometimes it's experimenting with the look of it and how it's presented can sometimes help
I get
as
that.
well.
My son very much will look at something to make the decision, and we can sometimes find it frustrating as parents because we're like, but you haven't actually tried it.
Yeah.
But he's made that decision on the sight of it as to whether he's going to try it.
And there is something. And as children get older, there's different methods as well. So again, as a child gets older, sort of like post sort of 7 years old, we tend to go down more of a food scientist experimenting route. So from like sort of 2 to 7, I do very much more like what I call magical thinking, and everything's quite magical and quite fun. You know how they believe in like the tooth fairy and all of that, and everything's magic, isn't it? And it's very creative at that age. And then when they get a little bit older, we tend to go more food scientist. So it is more testing the hypothesis. So you can be things like, okay, well, our eyes don't taste, so let's try just, cutting it up and smelling it to start with. Or let's try experimenting with this. What happens if we add this? What colour does that go? And we do it in a different way than we might do with younger children where it's much more play-based.
So you're still trying to push those boundaries on touch and sight rather than...
same principles, but just a different way because they're much more logical at that age and they've got much more that black and white thinking, haven't they? That everything's like, I believe this and, it's that kind of way of thinking.
Okay. Should we be using rewards around food?
Personally, no, again, because eating is really complex.
Yeah.
And I think for some children, it will work very short term. So they might want to please you and they might eat that food short term, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they've actually accepted that food or they're able to eat that food as well. Okay. So longer term, it tends not to work.
Doesn't work.
With eating, no.
Okay. And what role do emotions play around food?
I think a lot, especially for parents, I think, as well. And even for children as well. Like, you know what it's like when you feel hangry and it's the end of the day and you're really tired and everything else. And you just want to eat something that's easy to eat and you don't want to have to, like, do lots of thought into it and things like that. So, there's lots and lots of emotions. And also... there's a lot on social media about making sure a child's getting this food and that they're growing well and that, everything else. So much pressure, I think, on parents nowadays, particularly around food.
A lot of pressure to make sure the food's cut in a certain way. Looks, the lunchbox snacks provide everything and...
Instagram,
I understand that. Okay. So can you help me clear up a few myths around food? Is it true that children will never let themselves go hungry?
So, no. Basically, for some children, they will go hungry. Yeah. So for some of the children I work with, particularly with children who are like what I call real problem eaters or have a condition called ARFID as well, then they will. I have seen children starve themselves out and I have dealt with children who are tube fed as well. So that can happen.
Is it something on the whole we need to be worried about?
I wouldn't say it's something on the whole we'd need to be worried about. Yeah. Normally, most children are quite intuitive eaters. They tend to eat to their requirements. So I always say to parents, try and think of your child's food over a week rather than a day. Because again, especially with toddlers, there's very varying intake each day and everything else. But they tend to be quite intuitive eaters.
I've often found with mine, they might eat one big meal at times and then forego the other meals, but they seem to be happy on that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really, really common, especially in toddlers.
In toddlers.
Really common for them to do that. Yeah.
Okay. The same as I've also had another child that just wanted little and often throughout the entire day.
Yeah, so again, like everyone's different, aren't they, in terms of like what your appetite is. You know, a child who's maybe on the 99th centile will probably have a much bigger appetite than a child like mine who's on the 2nd centile. Right. You know, like genetics as well plays a part as well.
Okay. And do vitamins help with a child who's got a limited diet?
Yes.
Or any child?
Yeah, so definitely. I mean, all children from 6 months to 5 should have at least vitamin A and vitamin D. And everyone in the whole country of the UK should be having vitamin D as well because we don't get enough sunlight. So, yeah, they do have an important role. Additional vitamins, it depends on what your child's diet's like. I would say most common vitamin deficiency that I see is iron. So trying to make sure your child's getting enough iron-rich foods can be more.
Just give us some quick examples. What's iron in?
So iron's in things like red meat, like brown meat, like chicken, things like that. It's also in like things like baked beans, fortified cereals as well. Breakfast cereals are probably one of the best ways that a lot of children get iron in the UK, I would say, at the moment. There's other things like fortified, like smoothies, for example, for children that don't like fruit and vegetables. There are like fortified iron-rich smoothies. You can get the Arlo milk, which is one with a Gruffalo on that's got iron in. So there's lots of iron-rich foods if your child's a particularly restrictive eater and they don't eat meat and things like that as well that are high in iron as well. Beans and pulses as well are another good source
another
as well.
one. And how much variety do children really need?
So in terms of a meal, so we want them to ideally have some protein, some carbohydrates and fruit and vegetables, if possible. And obviously they need some kind of dairy as well in their diet as well, or dairy alternatives if obviously they've got an allergy or they can't tolerate dairy as well. So it's important to try and have the main food groups in their diet. And it might not be that every meal has all of those food groups in it, but it's about trying to get that variety.
Okay, and then we're taking the picture of the week.
Yeah, and then thinking about the whole week in terms of their food intake as well.
Okay, brilliant. All right, do you have any final words of wisdom for our listeners today of what you would advise if they've got a child with fussy eating or just anything that you think parents need to know to support their children with their eating?
I would definitely say trust your intuition. If you feel a child's eating is getting worse and worse and they're getting more and more restrictive and they're cutting more and more foods out, then I would definitely seek some help because I think the longer it goes on, a lot of children I see who are a lot older, 9, 10, things have been going on for a long, long time. So it's harder to sort of help as well. So I definitely say trust your intuition. If you feel that something's not right, then definitely reach out and get help as well. But I would also say as well, just if you're having a really tough time and meal times are really stressful at the moment, take a break as well. Yeah. And just everything that we suggested and talked about today, take note of that and try and, relax at the meal times as well. Yeah.
It's going to make the biggest difference.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, look, Emma, it's been an absolute pleasure to chat with you. Thank you so much for all that insightful advice. I know it's been a huge help for me. So I will take that away and definitely be putting some of the food in the middle of the table for the children to help themselves and trying to step back on the pressure and seeing if that can make some improvements at home. So thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been lovely.
Thanks, Emma.